Hi everyone, John Heath here again for MiltonRose Learning with another Let's Learn video on the context for Macbeth. So if you don't know your great chain of being from your Divine Right of Kings, then you're in the right place. So we're going to have a look today at some of the key contextual factors underpinning Jacobean society. We'll tease out Shakespeare's views as well, if we can get at those. Look at some of the key context in action and how that affects the play, and then we'll round out with some of the key contextual quotes, which will be really good for your essays. Okay, so first off then, let's just have a look in the top left corner. Okay, so first off then, if we have a nice look at Jacobean society and a couple of the key features there. Now, as you can see on that really interesting image there, which structures society, the Jacobeans believed in what was called the Great Chain of Being. Okay, and that's in that image on the left-hand side, which you can study. So they believed that the universe was structured in a kind of divine order that God had put in place. God, obviously, at the top, and then kings and queens, princes, princesses, going all the way down to lords, and then kind of peasants and whatnot at the bottom. And they believed that God had put the Great Chain of Being in place. So any challenges to that order were seen as a big no-no. That was a sin in this period because God has put the Great Chain of Being in place. So therefore, if you were lower down and you wanted to take the position of someone above you, okay, such as Macbeth, he wants to be king when he's only a lord, that was seen as a grave sin. Okay, it's a big no-no, and you could get into big trouble for that. So the Great Chain of Being really shapes the Jacobean kind of understanding of society at this time. Then also, as we can see there, there's patriarchal values. So patriarchal, male-dominated society. So men held power in this period, and women were expected to obey and just follow, and they were, having babies and staying in the kitchen most of the time, to stereotype it. However, Lady Macbeth cuts against the patriarchy and says, no, I'm going to assert my kind of feminine power. But her ambition would have shocked the Jacobean audience. I just thought, like, what's going on here? And that's like really strange. So they would have really struggled to understand Lady Macbeth, and she's a revolutionary character in her feminine kind of power. It's very important to understand how she undercuts and subverts patriarchy as well. Okay. So moving on, there's some other context we need to know. So with Macbeth, with the Jacobean audience, they were loyal to King James I. He was on the throne after Elizabeth had died, and they feared treason. So Macbeth's regicide, that means to kill a monarch, to kill a king or queen. So the regicide, when Macbeth kills King Duncan, would be deeply shocking to the audience because of the Great Chain of Being, as we've said, but because also of their loyalty to their real king, King James I, and that they feared treason, they didn't like it at all. Okay. Now, also, as you can see from the charming image, the supernatural was a big part of Jacobean culture. So witches and omens were seen as real threats. Witches were agents of the devil in this period, and you could be executed for if people thought you were a witch. So this was a real scary thing for them. And the Weird Sisters, or the three witches basically, play on those fears of the Jacobeans who saw witches everywhere and would be very scared of them. Okay, so it's very important to unravel that piece of context. Okay, now how does that feed in then to the big man, Shakespeare, to his views then in terms of the context? So I think when we kind of analyse it, and I analyse it with my classes at school, is this kind of a support for monarchy, I believe. So Shakespeare is reinforcing loyalty to the king and the dangers of ambition and treason. Okay, because look at what happens to Macbeth. He kills the king, he commits regicide, but look at what happens to him. Nothing good happens. His wife dies. He eventually ends up with his head on a spike. He wasn't able to pass on the throne to his children because he doesn't have any. So nothing good comes of that. And I think from that you can work out that Shakespeare is kind of backing up his real king, King James I, and saying, yeah, we don't want to commit treason or go against the king. Also, Shakespeare's belief in divine order and justice. I think we learnt about the great chain of being at the start of the lesson, and I think Shakespeare is kind of seeing that is the natural order and don't mess around with it, because if you do, then it can trigger death and tragedy. They mess around with the great chain of being in the play. They kill the king, they take over, but nothing good happens from it. They've ripped apart the great chain of being and triggered God's kind of anger, okay, which ends up in their tragic deaths for all of them. So it kind of, I think that's Shakespeare being a bit socially conservative and arguing that we need to keep the natural order, that great chain of being, we need to keep it in place. Okay. Right then. So how does this context play out in action? So let's have a little look. So first off, we have the divine right of kings and order. So they believed, similar to the great chain of being, that the divine right of kings is that the king was God's representative on earth. Okay, you've been put in place by God, so no one can touch you. But Macbeth's murder of King Duncan then violates the divine right of kings, disrupts the natural order, the great chain of being, and reflects Shakespeare's warning against treason and disloyalty, saying, look, don't do it, because if you do, this is what's going to happen. Okay, so it's almost a warning to any rebellious lords who might think about kind of getting rid of King James I. Very important political lesson there to learn. Then we have witchcraft and superstition. Okay, so as we know, they were scared witless of witches in this period. And so the three witches represent the Jacobean fears of witchcraft, or their social anxieties is probably a nicer way to put it in your essays. So their influence over Macbeth plays into King James I's obsession with the supernatural. King James I actually wrote a book called Demonology, if anyone's interested, on how to spot a witch. So he was obsessed with witches. So hence why the witches are there and playing on the king's kind of natural interest in the supernatural. And it shows how evil can twist ambition, because the witches kind of twist Macbeth's ambition and make him commit all sorts of nefarious acts. And then finally, context in action, we have ambition and masculinity. So Macbeth's struggle and Lady Macbeth's pressure, constant pressurising of him, reveal how Jacobean society linked masculinity with power. This is, if you wanted to be a big man in this Jacobean era, you had to be physically strong, ambitious, and kind of tougher than everybody else. And Macbeth is constantly having to live up to those expectations because his wife is constantly manipulating him to do that in the play, as you'll see when you study it. And Shakespeare critiques that, though, this almost toxic masculinity, we might call it today. And he critiques that by showing its destructive effects. He wants to be a tough guy, Macbeth, but look at what happens to him. It leads him into all manner of kind of evil acts, assassinations, madness, losing his wife at the end and ending up with his head on a spike. So the masculinity doesn't help. I think that's the point. And Shakespeare is trying to critique that masculinity and showing that it's kind of empty and it doesn't really go anywhere, really. Okay, now let's look at three of the best contextual quotes in the play. Okay, now the first one is, that divine right of kings and the great chain of being. So let's have a read of that quote. This is Macbeth talking. He hath honoured me of late, and I have bought golden opinions from all sorts of people, which would be not cast aside so soon as to be a fool. Now, with that quote, what he's kind of saying, this is early on in the play, Act 1, Scene 7, before the regicide. And it's reflecting Macbeth's awareness of the divine right of kings, as well as the authority that Duncan holds. He's saying, look, he's been good to me, and I don't really want to do this. This is not the best course of action. Murdering King Duncan is not just a political act, but as we know, it's a religious act. It's going against God. It's going against the great chain of being. And King Duncan is the divine king, so he's been put in place by God, so I don't really want to murder him because I'm going to offend God, and that could lead to Macbeth kind of being sent to hell when he dies. Okay, so it's a really big quote there to understand in terms of context. Now, next one, we have witchcraft and superstition. So a real classic quote from these three lovely characters. All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Glamis. All hail Macbeth, that shalt be king hereafter. Again, pretty early in the play, Act 1, Scene 3. Now, this is the three witches' prophecy, their prediction, and they tap into Jacobean fears of witchcraft and the supernatural, and they reflect society's belief in the power of witches during the reign of King James I, because they are predicting the future to Macbeth. They're seeing through time here. So they're saying to Macbeth, you're going to be Thane of Glamis or Lord of Glamis, and you will be king. And then 2 seconds later, a messenger comes and says, you are now Thane of Glamis. So it seems like they can see the future, and the audience would have been terrified there of these witches who can kind of manipulate time and kind of tell you what's going to happen before it actually happens. Okay, very scary. And then finally, let's look at ambition and masculinity. So again, this is Macbeth talking. I dare do all that may become a man. Who dares do more is none. And he's talking to his wife there. So this reflects Macbeth's internal conflict. So it highlights Jacobean ideas of masculinity. If you want to be seen as a big man in Jacobean society, you've got to be tough and really strong physically. But it's where power and violence were often equated with manliness in this era. So yeah, very kind of like toxic masculinity kind of thing. And Lady Macbeth challenges that masculinity by basically saying, well, if you're not going to kill King Duncan, then you're not a man. Very insulting. And so that plays on Macbeth's kind of crisis of masculinity, we could call it, if you want that for your essays. It's a great phrase. And it kind of plays on his fears, and so it leads him to go and kill King Duncan to please his wife and to seem like a very strong traditional Jacobean man, which obviously then leads to tragedy. So there we go. Okay, so if you just zoom out for a minute then, we've had a really nice look there through some of the key context for Macbeth, which is crucial if you want to get the high grades in your essays and also most crucially in the exams. So we've broke apart key concepts like the great chain of being and the divine right of kings. We've had a nice look as well at Shakespeare's social views and what he thought about the context. We've teased apart some of the key points surrounding the witches and superstition in this period. They were very scared of witchcraft. And then we've finished by having a nice look at 3 of the best contextual quotes, which would work in many of your essays. So really try and reflect on those and kind of analyse them if you can. Now, it just remains to say, obviously, as always, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe and the bell icon if you found this video useful. And please keep your eyes peeled, because we'll be making loads more videos on Macbeth and loads of your other kind of texts as well. So it just remains to say, obviously, thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon. Take care.